Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The photograph arrives at the Smithsonian's Conservation Laboratory on a humid September morning, sealed in a deteriorating leather album that smells of mildew and forgotten decades. Senior photograph conservator Margaret Chin receives it as part of a donated collection from an estate sale in Asheville, North Carolina. The collection belongs to the Henderson family, prominent landowners in the Blue Ridge Mountains during the late 19th century. Margaret has restored thousands of historical photographs throughout her 23-year career, but something about this particular image immediately captures her attention even before she removes it from its protective sleeve. The photograph measures 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing that has yellowed and warped with age. The emulsion has cracked in several places, creating a spider web pattern across the surface that threatens to obscure the subjects entirely. Margaret carefully places the photograph under her examination lamp, adjusting the angle to minimize glare on the damaged surface. Through her magnifying visor, she begins her preliminary assessment, noting the type of photographic process, the extent of deterioration, and the estimated costs of restoration. The image shows what appears to be a prosperous family posed on the front porch of a substantial wooden house. The architecture is typical of affluent Appalachian homesteads from that era, with elaborate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch supported by turned columns. 5 people occupy the foreground: a stern-faced man in his 40s wearing a dark suit and watch chain, a woman in a high-necked dress with elaborate embroidery seated beside him, and 3 children arranged by height from oldest to youngest. The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 14, stands rigidly beside her father. 2 younger boys, maybe 10 and 7 years old, sit cross-legged on the porch floor. Everyone stares directly at the camera with the unnaturally frozen expressions common in 19th century photography, when subjects had to remain motionless for extended exposure times. Margaret makes notes about the family's clothing, which indicates significant wealth. The woman's dress features expensive lace at the collar and cuffs. The man's suit appears to be of fine wool, likely imported from the Northeast or Europe. Even the children wear clothing that would have been considered luxurious for the time and place. A handwritten notation on the cardboard backing, barely legible after more than a century, reads, "Henderson Family, Prospect Hill, October 1894. She begins the chemical analysis that will determine the best restoration approach, carefully removing a microscopic sample from the edge of the photograph. The analysis confirms what she suspected. The image is a gelatin silver print, a process that became popular in the 1880s and replaced earlier albumin prints. This information will guide her choice of stabilizing chemicals and cleaning solutions. The work ahead will be delicate and time-consuming, requiring weeks of careful intervention to reverse more than 100 years of environmental damage. As Margaret prepares her workspace for the restoration process, she sets up her high-resolution digital scanner to create a detailed reference image before any physical restoration begins. This is standard protocol, ensuring that if anything goes wrong during the restoration, there will be at least a digital record of the photograph's original state. She adjusts the scanner settings for maximum resolution, knowing that the resulting file will be enormous but necessary for capturing every detail of the damaged image. The scan takes nearly 20 minutes to complete, and when the image finally appears on her computer monitor, Margaret increases the magnification to examine areas of damage more closely. She zooms in on the cracked emulsion near the bottom left corner, making notes about the pattern of deterioration. Then she moves systematically across the image, documenting every crack, every stain, every area where the photographic chemicals have degraded or separated from the paper base. It is during this detailed digital examination that Margaret notices something odd in the background of the photograph, partially obscured by both the deterioration of the image and the shadow of the porch overhang. She increases the magnification further and adjusts the brightness and contrast on her monitor. Behind the posed family, standing in the doorway of the house, there appears to be another figure. The person is mostly hidden in shadow, only partially visible, but definitely present in the frame. Margaret feels a familiar flutter of excitement that comes with discovering something unexpected in a historical photograph. These moments of revelation are why she chose this profession, why she spends countless hours hunched over damaged images in a temperature-controlled laboratory. She prints out a section of the digital scan, enlarging the background area, and studies it with fresh eyes. The figure in the doorway is definitely a woman, judging by the shape of the clothing. She appears to be wearing a simple dress without the elaborate details that characterize the clothing of the family in the foreground. Her posture suggests she was not meant to be part of the formal portrait, perhaps caught in the frame accidentally or perhaps deliberately positioned there by the photographer. The discovery raises immediate questions that Margaret knows she will need to investigate. Who was this woman? Why was she standing in the background during a formal family portrait? Was her presence intentional or accidental? Margaret has seen similar instances in historical photographs where servants or enslaved people appear in the background of family portraits, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes seemingly invisible to the photographer and subjects. But there is something about this particular image that troubles her in a way she cannot immediately articulate. She returns to the physical photograph, examining the background area with her most powerful magnifying lens. The damage to the emulsion is particularly severe in this section of the image, making it difficult to discern details with the naked eye. Margaret realizes that the full restoration process will be essential not just for preserving the photograph, but for revealing whatever story this hidden figure represents. Over the following days, Margaret begins the careful work of stabilizing the photograph's deteriorating surface. She works in a climate-controlled clean room, wearing cotton gloves and using tools that look more like those of a surgeon than a traditional conservator. Each step must be documented, each chemical intervention recorded for the archive. She starts by carefully humidifying the photograph in a controlled chamber, which helps to relax the curled and warped paper backing. Then, using specialized adhesives and Japanese tissue paper, she begins to repair the worst of the cracks in the emulsion, working under high magnification with brushes that contain only a few bristles. The work is meditative and requires absolute concentration. A single mistake could destroy details that have survived for more than a century. Margaret finds herself thinking about the people in the photograph as she works, wondering about their lives in the Appalachian Mountains during that transitional period of American history. The year 1894 places the image nearly 30 years after the end of the Civil War, a time when the South was still grappling with the aftermath of slavery and Reconstruction. The mountains of North Carolina had their own complex relationship with slavery and the war, different from the plantation economy of the coastal plains but not untouched by the institution's brutal legacy. As the restoration progresses and the image begins to clarify, the figure in the background becomes more distinct. Margaret can now see that the woman is indeed black, her features becoming clearer as the damaged emulsion is stabilized and cleaned. She stands perfectly still in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable in the shadows. Unlike the family in the foreground, who stare directly at the camera with the forced formality of posed subjects, this woman seems to be looking slightly away, her gaze directed at something outside the frame. Margaret photographs each stage of the restoration process, documenting the gradual revelation of details that have been obscured for decades. She notices that the woman's dress, while simple, appears to be clean and well-maintained. Her hair is covered with what might be a head wrap or kerchief, a style that was common among both enslaved and free black women during the 19th century. There are no obvious indicators of her status or relationship to the family in the foreground, no visual clues that immediately explain her presence in the photograph. After 2 weeks of careful work, the restoration reaches a critical phase. Margaret has stabilized the damaged areas and is now ready to attempt the delicate process of reducing the discoloration that has yellowed the highlights and obscured the shadows. She prepares a mild solution of hydrogen peroxide and ammonium hydroxide, a combination that can help to bleach away age-related staining without damaging the silver gelatin emulsion. The process must be done with extreme caution, as overtreatment can result in the complete loss of the image. She applies the solution with a soft brush, working in small sections and constantly monitoring the image under magnification. The transformation is gradual but remarkable. The dingy yellow tone begins to recede, revealing the original tonal range of the photograph. The family's clothing emerges with new clarity, showing textures and patterns that were previously invisible. The architectural details of the house become more distinct. And most significantly, The figure in the background becomes fully visible for the first time in perhaps 100 years. Margaret stops working and simply stares at the revealed image. The woman in the doorway is no longer a vague shadow but a real person, her face now clearly visible despite the poor lighting of the interior behind her. She appears to be middle-aged, with strong features and a direct gaze that, now fully visible, seems to be looking not away from the camera but directly at it. Her expression is complex, neither smiling nor frowning, but containing something that Margaret can only describe as knowing. It is the look of someone who understands exactly what is happening, who sees the performance of the formal family portrait for what it is, and who has her own unspoken commentary on the scene. The completed restoration reveals other details that were previously hidden. Behind the woman in the doorway, barely visible in the dim interior of the house, there appear to be cooking implements hanging on the wall. This suggests that the doorway leads to a kitchen or work area rather than a formal room. The woman's positioning, then, was likely not accidental. She was in her usual place, in the working heart of the house, when the photographers set up to capture the Henderson family in their Sunday finest on their elaborate front porch. Margaret creates a new set of high-resolution scans of the restored photograph, capturing details that the original scan could not reveal due to the damage. She adjusts the exposure and contrast to bring out the woman's features as clearly as possible, creating a separate file that focuses specifically on this background figure. Then she begins to write her conservation report, describing the restoration process and noting the presence of the woman in the doorway as a significant feature of the photograph that had been obscured by deterioration. But Margaret finds herself unable to complete the report in her usual clinical, objective style. There is something about this woman's face, now fully visible after being hidden for so long, that demands more than a simple technical description. Margaret has restored hundreds of photographs containing enslaved or formerly enslaved people, images that document one of the most painful chapters of American history. She has seen the formal portraits of enslaved workers lined up beside their owners, the images of children torn from their families, the documentation of a system built on human suffering. But this photograph feels different somehow, more intimate and more troubling. The Henderson family, so carefully posed in their prosperity, seem oblivious to the woman behind them. Or perhaps not oblivious but deliberately ignoring her presence, treating her as part of the background, no more significant than the turned columns or the gingerbread trim. The photographer, too, either did not notice her or did not consider her important enough to warrant adjustment of the composition. Only the woman herself seems fully aware of the moment, her eyes meeting the camera's lens with an expression that refuses to be ignored now that it has been revealed. Margaret decides to do something unusual. Instead of simply completing her conservation report and adding the photograph to the Smithsonian's archives, she begins to research the Henderson family and the history of Prospect Hill. She wants to know who this woman was, what her relationship to the family might have been, and what her presence in the photograph reveals about life in the Appalachian Mountains during that complex period of American history. The photograph, she realizes, is not just a technical restoration project. It is a document that contains layers of meaning, a window into a world where human beings were separated by lines of race and class that determined everything about their lives, from where they could stand in a photograph to whether they would be remembered at all. Margaret begins her research by examining the documentation that accompanied the photograph to the Smithsonian. The donation came from the estate of Eleanor Henderson Cartwright, who died at the age of 97 in a nursing home in Asheville. Eleanor was the last surviving direct descendant of the Henderson family and had no children of her own. Her estate consisted primarily of the family home, which had been sold decades earlier and converted into a bed and breakfast, and several boxes of personal papers, photographs, and memorabilia that Eleanor had maintained throughout her life. The collection had been offered to several local historical societies before the Smithsonian agreed to accept it, primarily because of the quality and quantity of the 19th century photographs it contained. Margaret contacts the estate attorney who handled the donation, hoping to gain access to the accompanying papers. The attorney, a tired-sounding man named Robert Fielding, explains that most of Eleanor's papers are still in storage at a facility outside Asheville, waiting to be processed by the Historical Society. He provides Margaret with contact information for the facility and permission to examine the materials as a representative of the Smithsonian. Margaret immediately makes arrangements to travel to North Carolina, taking a week of personal leave to pursue what has become more than a professional interest. The storage facility is a climate-controlled warehouse on the outskirts of Asheville, surrounded by the rolling foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The landscape is beautiful in early October, with the trees just beginning to turn color and the air carrying that particular crispness that comes with autumn in the mountains. Margaret arrives on a Tuesday morning and is met by the facility manager, who leads her to a small, windowless room where several boxes of Eleanor Henderson Cartwright's papers have been assembled for her examination. The boxes contain a mixture of materials spanning more than a century of family history. There are letters, legal documents, financial records, diaries, newspaper clippings, and more photographs. Margaret begins systematically, starting with materials from the 1890s, hoping to find some reference to the photograph or to the woman who appears in it. The work is slow and often frustrating. The documents are not organized chronologically, and many are in poor condition, the ink faded and the paper brittle with age. She finds the Henderson family's financial records from 1894 surprisingly detailed. James Henderson, the patriarch in the photograph, was indeed a wealthy man. His ledgers show income from multiple sources including timber sales, agricultural production, and what appears to be money lending to smaller farmers in the region. The expenditures are equally revealing, showing payments for imported goods, expensive clothing, and improvements to the family home. There are also regular payments to various individuals, some clearly identified as employees or contractors, others listed only by initials or first names. Among these payment records, Margaret finds repeated entries for someone identified only as Rose, with payments listed every month throughout 1894 and beyond. The amounts are small but regular, suggesting either wages or some kind of allowance. Could this be the woman in the photograph? Margaret makes careful notes, copying down every reference to Rose that she can find. The payments continue year after year, though the amounts vary. Sometimes there are gaps of several months, then the payments resume. The last payment to Rose is recorded in 1912, 18 years after the photograph was taken. Margaret continues searching through the boxes, looking for anything that might provide more information about Rose's identity or her relationship to the Henderson family. She finds fragments of correspondence, including several letters from James Henderson to business associates in which he discusses labor problems and the difficulty of finding reliable workers in the post-war South. His language is revealing, filled with complaints about formerly enslaved people who had the audacity to demand fair wages or to leave employment without notice. He writes with barely concealed resentment about the changes that have disrupted what he clearly considers the natural order of society. In one letter dated 1895, James writes to a cousin in Virginia, "The old ways are gone and we must adapt, though it grieves me to pay wages to those who should be grateful merely for employment and shelter. Rose at least understands her place and does not trouble me with constant demands like some of the younger ones. She remembers how things were and knows that her situation now, however humble, is better than what might have been." The letter makes Margaret's stomach tighten. The casual cruelty of the language, the assumption of superiority, the reference to how things were that can only mean the period of slavery, all paint a disturbing picture of the Henderson household. And the specific mention of Rose, the suggestion that she remembers how things were, strongly implies that she had been enslaved either by the Henderson family or by someone else before the end of the war. Margaret takes photographs of the letter and continues her search with renewed urgency. She finds more correspondence, more financial records, more fragments of the family's history. Sarah Henderson, the matron in the photograph, kept a diary sporadically between 1890 and 1905. The entries are brief and often mundane, recording social visits, church attendance, and household matters. But occasionally, Sarah mentions Rose, though always in passing and always in the context of domestic work. "Rose prepared an excellent Sunday dinner today. I must remember to have her use less salt in the potatoes," reads one entry from November 1894, just a month after the photograph was taken. Another entry from 1897 notes, "Rose has been ill this past week. I have had to manage the kitchen myself and find the work quite exhausting. I do not know how she maintains such standards day after day." The diary entries reveal a complete disconnect between Sarah's recognition of Rose's skill and labor and any acknowledgement of her humanity or dignity. Rose exists in these pages only as a function, a set of tasks to be performed, never as a person with her own thoughts, feelings, or life outside the Henderson household. Margaret spends 3 full days in the storage facility, working through lunch and staying until closing time each evening. She photographs hundreds of pages of documents, building a comprehensive archive of material related to the Henderson family. She finds records of births, deaths, marriages, and property transactions. She finds photographs of the children as they grew older, of the house through different seasons and decades, of the family at various gatherings and celebrations. But she finds no other photographs that clearly show Rose, no personal papers belonging to her, no letters written in her hand. Rose exists in the documentary record only through the observations and comments of the white family she served, a ghost present only in the shadows of other people's lives. On her 4th day at the storage facility, Margaret discovers something unexpected. Hidden in a box of miscellaneous papers from the early 20th century, she finds a small ledger book that appears to be a household inventory from 1906. The book lists furnishings, kitchenware, linens, and other household goods in meticulous detail. But tucked between the pages, apparently used as a bookmark at some point, is a small photograph that someone has torn roughly in half. The photograph shows a woman standing alone in front of a simple wooden cabin. She is black, wearing a plain dress and apron, her hair covered with a kerchief. She stands very straight, her hands at her sides, looking directly at the camera with an expression of quiet dignity. The photograph is undated and unmarked, but the clothing style and photographic process suggest it is from roughly the same era as the Henderson family portrait. And though the woman is alone in this image, there is something familiar about her face, her posture, her direct gaze. Margaret returns to her laptop and pulls up the enhanced image of the woman in the doorway of the Henderson photograph. She places the torn photograph beside the screen and compares the two faces. The quality of the small photograph is poor, and the angle is different, but Margaret is increasingly certain that she is looking at the same woman. Rose, photographed on her own terms, standing in front of what might have been her own home, claiming a space and a presence that the Henderson family portrait had tried to deny her. The torn edge of the photograph is troubling. Someone deliberately destroyed this image, tearing it in half and discarding it among household inventories as if it were trash. Was this done by a member of the Henderson family? If so, why? What was it about this photograph of Rose that warranted its destruction? Margaret carefully photographs the damaged image, making notes about where it was found and the condition in which she discovered it. She continues her search with even greater intensity, hoping to find the other half of the torn photograph or some explanation for its destruction. But the remaining boxes yield little additional information about Rose. Margaret does find census records for the Henderson household from 1900 and 1910. The 1900 census lists Rose Williams, black, female, age 55, servant, as a member of the household. The 1910 census shows Rose Williams, black, female, age 65, servant, still living with the Henderson family. These census records provide crucial information. Rose had a surname, Williams. She was born around 1845, which means she would have been approximately 49 years old when the 1894 photograph was taken. More significantly, she was born during slavery, in a time and place where black children were considered property rather than people. The census records also confirm that Rose remained with the Henderson family for at least 16 years after the photograph was taken, working as a servant well into her 60s and possibly beyond. Margaret searches for Rose Williams in other records, hoping to trace her life before and after her time with the Henderson family. She finds the name Rose Williams appearing in several documents from the period, but determining which records refer to the same person proves nearly impossible. The name was common, and many formerly enslaved people took surnames like Williams when they were freed, either choosing names that resonated with them or adopting the surnames of their former owners. Without more specific information, Margaret cannot be certain which of the many Rose Williams in the historical record is the woman from the photograph. She does find some general historical context that helps her understand the world Rose Williams would have inhabited. The mountain region of North Carolina where the Henderson family lived had a complex relationship with slavery. The area had fewer large plantations than the coastal plains, and many mountain families either owned no enslaved people or owned only a few. But slavery still existed in the region, and those who were enslaved in the mountains often worked in different conditions than plantation laborers, frequently living in closer proximity to white families and performing domestic or skilled labor rather than agricultural work. After the Civil War and emancipation, many formerly enslaved people in the mountain regions faced limited options. Some were able to acquire small parcels of land and establish independent lives. Others continued to work for white families, often for low wages and under conditions that were only marginally better than slavery. The promise of Reconstruction was betrayed in North Carolina as it was throughout the South, and black citizens found themselves subjected to Jim Crow laws, economic exploitation, and constant threats of violence. For someone like Rose Williams, remaining with a family like the Hendersons might have been not a choice but a necessity, the only option available in a world that offered black women few paths to survival. Margaret contacts several historians who specialize in African American history in Appalachia, sending them copies of the photographs and documents she has discovered. The responses are thoughtful and help her understand the broader context of Rose's life. One historian points out that the fact Rose appears in the Henderson family photograph at all is significant. Many white families of the era would have insisted that servants remain completely out of frame during formal portraits, treating them as invisible. Rose's presence in the doorway, however shadowed and marginalized, suggests a slightly different dynamic, though not necessarily a more humane one. Another historian notes the importance of Rose's direct gaze in the small torn photograph. For a black woman to look directly at the camera during this period, to claim that visual space and that moment of being seen, was an act of subtle resistance. The formal conventions of 19th-century photography, particularly in the South, often positioned black subjects in ways that reinforced their subordinate status, looking away from the camera or appearing in service positions. For Rose to stand alone and meet the camera's eye was a declaration of selfhood and dignity that challenged the entire system designed to deny her humanity. Margaret returns to Washington after her week in North Carolina with hundreds of pages of documentation, photographs, and a deepening sense that the Henderson family portrait represents something more complex and painful than a simple historical curiosity. She has found evidence of Rose Williams's existence, fragments of a life lived in the shadows of a white family's prosperity. But she has also found the limits of the historical record, the silences and absences that surround the lives of people who were systematically erased from official narratives even as they built and maintained the households that generated those narratives. Back in her laboratory, Margaret creates a detailed digital file containing all of her research. She includes the restored Henderson family photograph, with special attention to the figure of Rose Williams in the doorway. She adds the torn photograph of Rose standing alone, digitally reconstructing what the full image might have looked like before its destruction. She compiles the relevant census records, financial ledgers, diary entries, and correspondence. The result is a comprehensive archive that documents not just the technical restoration of a damaged photograph but the partial recovery of a life that history had tried to forget. Margaret knows that her research has raised more questions than it has answered. Who took the photograph of Rose standing alone? Where was the cabin in the photograph located? What happened to Rose after the last payment to her was recorded in 1912? Did she have family, children, descendants who might carry her memory? And most troubling of all, what was the true nature of her relationship with the Henderson family? Was she grateful for employment, as James Henderson had written, or was she trapped by circumstances that offered no real alternative? These questions cannot be answered through the documentary record alone. The voices of people like Rose Williams were rarely recorded, their perspectives rarely preserved, their stories rarely told except through the distorting lens of those who held power over them. Margaret realizes that to truly understand the Henderson family photograph, to honor Rose Williams's presence in the image, she will need to look beyond the conventional archives and seek out alternative sources of information. She will need to find the communities and descendants who keep alive the stories that official history tried to erase. Margaret's research takes on a new dimension when she decides to travel back to the Appalachian region, this time not to examine documents in storage facilities but to speak with people who might have connections to the history she is investigating. She contacts the Asheville branch of the NAACP, several black churches in the region, and local historical societies that focus specifically on African American history in the mountains. Her inquiries lead her to a woman named Dr. Vivian Moore, a retired professor of history at a small college in the region who has spent decades documenting the experiences of black families in Appalachia. Dr. Moore agrees to meet with Margaret at her home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Asheville. The house is modest but comfortable, filled with books, photographs, and artifacts that speak to a life devoted to preserving difficult histories. Dr. Moore is in her 70s, sharp-eyed and direct in her manner, with a voice that carries both warmth and authority. She invites Margaret into her study, where several filing cabinets and overflowing bookshelves testify to decades of research. Margaret shares the Henderson family photograph, along with all the documentation she has gathered about Rose Williams. Dr. Moore studies the images carefully, using a magnifying glass to examine details, her expression growing more somber as she takes in the contrast between the prosperous family in the foreground and the woman standing in the shadows behind them. She asks thoughtful questions about where the photograph was found, what other documentation exists, and what motivated Margaret to pursue this research so intensively. Dr. Moore explains that stories like Rose Williams's are both common and frustratingly difficult to trace. The documentary record from the post-emancipation South is riddled with gaps and silences around black lives, especially the lives of women who worked as domestic servants. These women occupied an uncomfortable position, living intimately within white households while remaining socially and legally separate, their labor essential yet their persons invisible. Many were formerly enslaved people who had nowhere else to go after emancipation, trapped by a combination of economic necessity, limited education, and a hostile social environment that offered few opportunities for black women to achieve independence. The payments to Rose Williams that Margaret found in the Henderson financial records are particularly revealing, Dr. Moore explains. The small, regular amounts suggest that Rose was not simply an employee who could leave at will but someone in a dependent relationship with the family. The gaps in payments might indicate periods when Rose was unable to work due to illness or when the family chose to withhold wages for some perceived infraction. This kind of economic control was common in households throughout the South, a way of maintaining power over black workers even after slavery had been legally abolished. Dr. Moore also points out something Margaret had not fully considered. The fact that the Henderson family photograph was taken in 1894 suggests that Rose had remained with the family, or returned to them, after a period that would have given her the theoretical option to leave. By 1894, nearly 30 years had passed since emancipation. Rose would have been in her late 40s or early 50s, old enough to have potentially established an independent life if such a thing had been possible for a black woman in that time and place. Her continued presence with the Henderson family speaks to the limited choices available to her and to the ways that the legacy of slavery continued to structure black lives long after the institution's legal end. Margaret asks Dr. Moore if there might be any way to trace Rose Williams's family or descendants. Dr. Moore is honest about the challenges involved. Many black families from that era have genealogical records that are incomplete or non-existent, destroyed by discriminatory policies, natural disasters, or simply the passage of time. However, she suggests several approaches that might yield results. She recommends searching through black church records from the area, as churches often maintain their own documentation of births, deaths, and marriages. She also suggests looking for Rose Williams in later census records and death certificates, though she warns that the information in such documents is often inaccurate or incomplete for black individuals. Most significantly, Dr. Moore offers to put Margaret in touch with several families in the region who have deep roots in the local black community and who maintain oral histories passed down through generations. These families often know stories that never made it into official records, memories of grandparents and great-grandparents who lived through slavery and its aftermath. While there is no guarantee that anyone will remember Rose Williams specifically, there is a chance that someone might recognize her name or have information about black domestic workers who were associated with prominent white families like the Hendersons. Over the following weeks, Margaret conducts a series of interviews with members of the local black community, facilitated by Dr. Moore's connections and endorsement. She meets with elderly men and women who share stories about their ancestors, about the hardships and small victories that characterized Black life in the mountains during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She hears accounts of families who managed to purchase small plots of land, of children who learned to read despite laws designed to keep them ignorant, of communities that maintained their dignity and humanity in the face of systematic oppression. The stories are powerful and often heartbreaking, revealing a world of resilience and suffering that exists in stark contrast to the official narratives of Southern history that Margaret learned in school. She hears about the convict leasing system that effectively re-enslaved Black men on false charges, about lynchings and racial violence that went unpunished, about the constant vigilance required simply to survive in a society that viewed Black people as less than human. But she also hears about joy and celebration, about weddings and births and Sunday dinners, about the creation of separate institutions and spaces where Black people could be fully themselves, away from white surveillance and control. None of the people Margaret interviews remembers Rose Williams by name, but several recall stories about Black women who worked for wealthy white families in the area during that period. One woman, 93-year-old Mrs. Lucille Sampson, tells Margaret about her grandmother, who had been enslaved before the war and who continued to work as a cook for a white family until her death in the 1920s. Mrs. Sampson describes how her grandmother would come home exhausted every evening, her hands rough from work, her spirit worn down by the daily indignities of serving people who treated her with casual contempt even as they depended on her labor. Mrs. Sampson also shares a detail that resonates deeply with Margaret. Her grandmother kept a small photograph of herself, taken sometime in the early 20th century, which she treasured as proof of her existence and worth. The photograph showed her grandmother standing alone, looking directly at the camera with fierce pride. When Mrs. Sampson was a child, her grandmother would show her this photograph and tell her to remember that she was somebody, that no matter what the world tried to tell her, she had value and dignity. The photograph was lost when Mrs. Sampson's childhood home burned down in the 1960s, but the memory of her grandmother's insistence on being seen, on being remembered, remains vivid. The story reminds Margaret of the torn photograph of Rose Williams standing alone in front of the cabin. She wonders if Rose had kept that photograph for similar reasons, as her assertion of self that stood in contrast to her position in the Henderson household. And she wonders again about the torn edge, about whose hands destroyed that image and why they felt the need to do so. Margaret's most significant breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. While searching through digitized church records from the Second Baptist Church in Asheville, one of the oldest Black churches in the region, she finds a record of a Rose Williams listed among the founding members when the church was established in 1873. The record includes a notation that she came to Asheville from a rural area called Prospect Hill, the same name mentioned on the Henderson family photograph. This confirmation that Rose Williams was in the area and had connections to a Black church provides a crucial link. The church records also show that Rose Williams was an active member of the congregation for many years, though her attendance becomes sporadic in the early 1900s. She is listed as having paid small contributions to the church building fund over many years, and her name appears on several church committee rosters. Most significantly, the records show that a funeral was held for Rose Williams at the church in June 1913. She was 68 years old at the time of her death, having lived through slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, and the Jim Crow era that followed. The funeral record notes that Rose Williams was survived by a daughter, Emily Williams Johnson, living in Cincinnati, Ohio. This single line of text opens up new possibilities for Margaret's research. She immediately begins searching for Emily Williams Johnson in Cincinnati records from the early 20th century, hoping to find descendants who might still be living and who might know family stories about Rose. The search is complicated and time-consuming. Cincinnati had a substantial Black community in the early 20th century, and there are many women with similar names in the records. But Margaret persists, working with genealogical databases and reaching out to historical societies in Ohio. After several weeks of dead ends and false leads, she finds a marriage record for Emily Williams Johnson dated 1887, showing that she married a man named Thomas Johnson, a skilled carpenter who had migrated north from Kentucky. The marriage record leads to census records showing the Johnson family growing over the years, with several children born in the 1890s and early 1900s. Margaret traces the family through subsequent decades, following the children as they grow up, marry, and have children of their own. The work is painstaking, requiring her to piece together fragments of information from multiple sources, but gradually a family tree begins to emerge, connecting Rose Williams to descendants who lived through the entire 20th century and into the present. The search eventually leads Margaret to a woman named Patricia Johnson Williams, living in Columbus, Ohio. Patricia is Rose Williams's great-great-granddaughter, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher who has done some genealogical research into her own family history. When Margaret contacts her and explains the purpose of her research, Patricia expresses both surprise and cautious interest. She knows relatively little about her great-great-grandmother Rose, as the family stories that were passed down focused more on the generations who came after her, the ones who built lives in the North and achieved educational and economic success that would have been impossible in the post-war South. Margaret arranges to visit Patricia in Columbus, bringing with her copies of all the photographs and documents she has collected. When Patricia sees the Henderson family photograph with Rose Williams standing in the doorway, she goes very quiet. She studies the image for a long time, taking in every detail of her ancestor's face, the set of her shoulders, the expression in her eyes. When she finally speaks, her voice is thick with emotion. Patricia shares what little she knows about Rose Williams from family stories. Her great-grandmother Emily, Rose's daughter, had left North Carolina as a young woman and rarely spoke about her childhood or her mother. The family understood that Emily wanted to leave the South behind, to escape the memories of oppression and limited possibility that characterized Black life in the mountain regions. Emily had worked hard to build a new life in Cincinnati, to raise her children with opportunities she never had, to become part of a thriving Black community in the North. Looking back to North Carolina, to the circumstances of her mother's life, was too painful, but Patricia remembers one story that her own grandmother told her, a story passed down from Emily. When Emily was a small child, her mother Rose worked for a wealthy white family, living in their house and caring for their children while her own daughter was looked after by other members of the Black community. Emily rarely saw her mother, and when she did, Rose was always tired, always worried, always moving between two worlds that demanded everything from her and gave little in return. Rose had wanted desperately for Emily to have a different life, to escape the cycle of domestic service and dependence on white families. She had saved what little money she could and eventually sent Emily north to live with relatives when she was 15 years old, sacrificing their relationship so that her daughter might have a chance at something better. Emily never returned to North Carolina after leaving at 15. She married Thomas Johnson in Cincinnati and built a life far from the mountains and the family that had employed her mother. Rose remained in North Carolina, continuing to work for the Henderson family until illness and age finally made work impossible. The small payments that Margaret found in the Henderson records, continuing until 1912, represented most of what Rose earned in her lifetime. It was never enough to allow her to leave, never enough to build an independent life, barely enough to survive. Patricia tells Margaret that Emily died in 1948 without ever having returned to visit her mother's grave. The separation had been too painful, the memories too difficult. Emily wanted her children and grandchildren to think of themselves as Northern people, as free from the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow as it was possible to be. She succeeded in many ways, raising children who became teachers, nurses, and professionals, creating a family legacy of education and achievement. But the cost of that success was a profound disconnection from the past, from the woman who had endured so much to make that future possible. Looking at the photograph of Rose Williams standing in the doorway of the Henderson house, Patricia begins to cry quietly. She tells Margaret that she is grateful to finally see her great-great-grandmother's face, to have this visual connection to a woman who existed only as a name and a few fragmentary stories in the family's oral history. But she is also angry at the circumstances that trapped Rose in a life of servitude, angry at the Henderson family who benefited from her labor while treating her as invisible, angry at the historical forces that made such exploitation seem normal and acceptable. Margaret and Patricia spend hours together, going through all the documents and photographs, piecing together as much of Rose Williams's story as the limited evidence allows. They examine the torn photograph of Rose standing alone, and Patricia says that she would like to have a copy, to finally have an image of her ancestor that shows her not as a background figure in someone else's family portrait but as a person in her own right. Margaret promises to create a carefully restored copy, doing everything she can to honor the dignity and strength that radiates from Rose's direct gaze. Before Margaret leaves Columbus, Patricia shares one more thing. Among her family papers, she has kept a small leather-bound notebook that belonged to her great-grandmother Emily. Emily rarely wrote about her childhood, but there are a few brief entries about her mother. In one, written in 1920, 7 years after Rose's death, Emily writes, "I dream sometimes about Mama standing in the doorway of that house, watching me leave. I was so eager to go, so desperate to escape, that I barely looked back. I thought I would see her again, that once I had established myself up north, I could send for her, give her the kind of life she deserved. But it never happened. She stayed in that house, cooking in that kitchen, serving that family, until she was too old and sick to work anymore. They let her go then, put her in a room at the church and paid a neighbor to check on her. She died alone and I was not there. That is something I will carry with me all my life." The entry makes clear what Margaret had suspected. Rose Williams's relationship with the Henderson family was one of exploitation masked as employment, of dependence created by a society that offered black women no real alternatives. The payments in the Henderson ledgers, the references to Rose, knowing her place, the photograph that captures her presence yet marginalizes it, all tell the story of a woman trapped in a system that valued her labor while denying her humanity. Margaret returns to Washington with a much fuller understanding of the Henderson family photograph and the life of Rose Williams. She now knows not just the technical details of the image's restoration but the human story it contains, the complex and painful history of race, labor, and family that exists in the shadows and margins of the frame. She knows that Rose Williams was not simply a servant who happened to be caught in the background of a family portrait. She was a woman who had lived through slavery, who had tried to build a life for herself and her daughter in the aftermath of emancipation, who had endured decades of work for a family that never saw her as fully human. And she was also a woman who had looked at the camera with knowing eyes, who had stood alone for a photograph that declared her existence and her worth, who had fought in small but significant ways to be seen and remembered. The restoration of the Henderson family photograph is complete, but Margaret finds herself unable to simply file it away in the Smithsonian's archives and move on to the next project. The image has become something more than a technical achievement or a historical curiosity. It has become a moral challenge, a question about how we remember the past and whose stories we choose to preserve. Margaret prepares a comprehensive exhibition proposal for the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The proposal centers on the Henderson family photograph as a case study in hidden histories and the lives that exist in the margins of official narratives. She includes the restored photograph with detailed information about Rose Williams, contrasting the family's visible prosperity with the invisible labor that sustained it. She adds the torn photograph of Rose standing alone, presented as a companion piece that offers an alternative vision of a woman claiming her own space and dignity. The proposal also includes selected documents from the Henderson family papers, showing the financial arrangements and casual references to Rose that reveal the nature of their relationship. Most importantly, Margaret proposes including material from her interviews with Patricia Johnson Williams and other descendants of black families from the region. She wants the exhibition to present not just the artifacts and documents but the human impact of the histories they represent. She wants visitors to understand that photographs like the Henderson family portrait are never neutral records of the past but are always shaped by power relationships, always include some people while excluding or marginalizing others, always tell partial stories that need to be questioned and complicated. The museum's exhibition committee responds to Margaret's proposal with interest but also with concerns. Several committee members worry that the exhibition might be too confrontational, too focused on the negative aspects of American history, too likely to make visitors uncomfortable. They suggest softening the language, perhaps emphasizing the progress that has been made since the 1890s rather than dwelling on the exploitation and injustice that characterized the period. They worry that focusing too much on Rose Williams might unfairly vilify the Henderson family, who were simply products of their time and cannot be judged by contemporary moral standards. Margaret pushes back against these concerns, arguing that discomfort is precisely the point. The Henderson family photograph is uncomfortable because it captures a reality that we would prefer to forget, a system of racial oppression that is woven into the foundation of American society. Softening the presentation, emphasizing progress over injustice, would be another form of erasure, another way of making Rose Williams invisible. The exhibition needs to center her story, needs to force viewers to confront the woman in the doorway and to ask themselves what obligations we have to remember people like her, to tell their stories even when those stories complicate our national narratives. The debate within the museum continues for months, with Margaret and her allies arguing for a bold, unflinching presentation and others advocating for a more cautious approach. Eventually, a compromise is reached. The exhibition will proceed, but it will be positioned as part of a larger series on hidden histories and marginalized communities. The Henderson family photograph will be the centerpiece, but it will be surrounded by other examples of how historical photographs both reveal and conceal, both document and distort. As the exhibition comes together, Margaret works closely with Patricia Johnson Williams to ensure that Rose Williams is represented with dignity and accuracy. Patricia provides family photographs and documents that show the lives Rose's descendants built, the ways they carried forward her legacy of resilience and determination even as they tried to escape the circumstances that had trapped her. The exhibition includes photographs of Emily Williams Johnson in Cincinnati, of her children and grandchildren, of the family gatherings and celebrations that marked their lives in the North. These images provide a counterpoint to the Henderson family photograph, showing the possibilities that opened up when Black people were able to move beyond the constraints of the Jim Crow South. Patricia also insists that the exhibition include information about what happened to the Henderson family. Margaret's research has revealed that the family's prosperity did not last much beyond the generation captured in the 1894 photograph. James Henderson lost much of his wealth in the economic depressions of the early 20th century. The family home was sold in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, and the remaining Henderson descendants dispersed to other parts of the country. By the time Eleanor Henderson Cartwright donated the family papers to the Smithsonian, there was little left of the fortune that James Henderson had amassed through timber sales and agricultural production and moneylending. Patricia finds bitter satisfaction in this information. The Henderson family's wealth was built on the exploitation of people like her great-great-grandmother Rose, on a system that extracted value from Black labor while giving little or nothing in return. That such wealth proved unsustainable, that it could not secure the family's position across generations, seems to her a kind of rough justice, though she knows it is cold comfort. Rose Williams and countless others like her paid the price for that wealth with their lives, with their dignity, with their dreams for themselves and their children. The exhibition opens on a humid evening in June, more than 2 years after Margaret first noticed the shadowy figure in the doorway of the Henderson family photograph. The museum has publicized the event extensively, and the turnout is strong, with several hundred people attending the opening reception. Margaret stands near the central display, watching visitors encounter the photograph for the first time, seeing their reactions as they read the accompanying text about Rose Williams and the Henderson family. Some visitors are visibly moved, standing in front of the photograph for long minutes, studying Rose's face and reading every word of the exhibition text. Others seem uncomfortable, hurrying past the display after a brief glance, perhaps unwilling to engage with the difficult questions the exhibition raises. A few visitors, mostly older white men and women, complain to museum staff that the exhibition is biased, that it unfairly vilifies the Henderson family, that it focuses too much on negative aspects of history rather than celebrating American achievements. Patricia Johnson Williams attends the opening with several of her family members, including her adult children and grandchildren. They stand together in front of the photograph of Rose Williams, the image finally restored and visible after being hidden in shadows for more than a century. Patricia's granddaughter, a 28-year-old graduate student in African American history, tears up as she looks at her ancestor's face. She tells Margaret that she has been doing research on Black women's labor in the post-emancipation South for her dissertation, but it has all been abstract until this moment. Seeing Rose Williams, knowing that this is her own great-great-great-grandmother, makes the history suddenly personal and immediate and overwhelming. The exhibition generates significant media attention, with articles appearing in newspapers and history magazines across the country. Some of the coverage is positive, praising the museum for tackling difficult historical subjects and for centering the stories of people who are usually invisible in historical narratives. Other coverage is critical, accusing the museum of presentism and of judging historical figures by standards they could not have known. Conservative commentators argue that the exhibition is an example of woke ideology infecting American institutions, an attempt to make white Americans feel guilty about the past rather than proud of their heritage. Margaret expected the controversy and tries not to let it distract her from what she considers the exhibition's core purpose. She gives interviews to reporters, explaining the restoration process and the research that uncovered Rose Williams's story. She talks about the importance of looking at historical photographs critically, of asking who is present and who is absent, who is centered and who is marginalized. She argues that understanding the full complexity of American history, including its most painful aspects, is not about creating guilt but about creating knowledge, about seeing the past clearly so that we can understand how it has shaped the present. The exhibition runs for 6 months at the Smithsonian before beginning a national tour to other museums and educational institutions. At each venue, the response is similar: strong interest from many visitors, discomfort and resistance from others, and always a sense that the photograph of Rose Williams standing in the doorway is asking questions that cannot be easily answered. Who was she beyond the bare facts that the historical record provides? What did she think about as she stood in that doorway while the Henderson family posed for their portrait? What did she feel about the family she served, about the circumstances that had shaped her life, about the daughter she sent away so that Emily might have better possibilities? These questions cannot be fully answered because Rose Williams left no written record, no diary or letters that would give us access to her inner life. She exists in history primarily through other people's observations and comments, through financial ledgers and census records, through the brief mentions in Sarah Henderson's diary and the references in James Henderson's correspondence. But the photograph gives us something that these documents cannot. It gives us her face, her body, her physical presence in the world. It shows us a woman who stood in a doorway, who met the camera's gaze with knowing eyes, who existed not just as a function or a servant but as a person with her own consciousness and her own understanding of the world around her. Margaret continues to think about Rose Williams long after the exhibition has closed at the Smithsonian and moved on to other venues. The photograph hangs in her office, a reminder of the work she does and why it matters. She has restored countless historical photographs over her career, but this one has changed something in how she approaches her work. Every photograph she handles now, she looks for the figures in the background, the people in the margins, the lives that exist at the edges of the frame. She asks herself who is being rendered invisible, whose story is not being told, and what obligations she has as a conservator and as a human being to make those hidden stories visible. Patricia Johnson Williams and Margaret remain in contact, corresponding regularly about family history and the ongoing legacy of Rose Williams. Patricia tells Margaret that the exhibition has changed how her family thinks about their past, has made them more interested in tracing their roots and understanding the full scope of their history. Her grandchildren are asking questions about their ancestors, wanting to know not just about the success stories but about the struggles and hardships that came before. The photograph of Rose Williams has become a focal point for these conversations, a tangible connection to a past that might otherwise remain abstract. Several years after the exhibition first opens, Patricia contacts Margaret with news that she has been working with a genealogist to fill in more details about Rose Williams's life. The research has uncovered some new information, including a record of Rose's birth in 1845 on a plantation in South Carolina. The plantation owner was a man named Thomas Henderson, whom Margaret's research reveals was James Henderson's uncle. This connection confirms what the documentary evidence had suggested. Rose Williams had been enslaved by James Henderson's family before the Civil War. When Thomas Henderson died in 1867, his nephew James inherited not his enslaved people, as slavery had been abolished, but his property and influence. Rose, having nowhere else to go and needing to survive, had likely entered into an employment arrangement with James Henderson that carried forward many of the dynamics of the previous relationship. The genealogist has also found a record of Rose's first marriage in 1865, shortly after emancipation, to a man named Samuel Williams. The marriage certificate lists both Rose and Samuel as formerly enslaved by Thomas Henderson. Samuel Williams appears in a few documents from the late 1860s as working as a laborer in the area, but then disappears from the record after 1870. Patricia and the genealogists speculate that Samuel may have died or may have left the area seeking work elsewhere, leaving Rose alone with a young daughter to support. This would explain why Rose remained with the Henderson family for so long, why she had no other option but to continue working for the people who had once owned her. These additional details fill out Rose Williams's story but also make it more heartbreaking. She was born into slavery, lived her first 20 years as someone else's property, and then discovered that freedom meant primarily the freedom to struggle for survival in a world that remained deeply hostile to Black people. She married and had a daughter, but her husband vanished from her life, leaving her to navigate single motherhood in a society that offered Black women almost no support or protection. She sent her daughter north, sacrificing their relationship in hopes that Emily might have the opportunities that had been denied to her. And she remained with the Henderson family until old age and illness made it impossible to continue, dying in a room provided by a church, cared for by neighbors because the family she had served for decades no longer had use for her. Margaret incorporates this new information into the exhibition materials, updating the text panels and creating new supplementary materials for schools and educational groups that use the exhibition as a teaching tool. She wants students to understand not just the facts of Rose Williams's life but the structural forces that shaped that life, the ways that slavery created patterns of dependency and exploitation that continued long after emancipation. She wants them to see how one woman's story connects to larger historical processes, how individual lives are always embedded in social and economic systems that distribute power and resources unequally. The Henderson family photograph continues to circulate, appearing in textbooks and documentaries about American history, in articles about photograph restoration and historical interpretation. Rose Williams becomes, in a small way, a face that people associate with the hidden histories of slavery and its aftermath. Her presence in the doorway, once obscured by deterioration and shadow, now stands as a reminder that every historical photograph contains more than what is immediately visible, that the background of an image can be as important as the foreground, that the people we have been taught not to see deserve to be recognized and remembered. Margaret sometimes wonders what Rose Williams would think about becoming a subject of historical interest, about having her photograph displayed in museums and written about in books. Would she be pleased to finally be seen and acknowledged? Would she be angry that this recognition came only after her death, only after generations of her descendants had built lives far from the mountains where she suffered? Would she want to be remembered primarily through her connection to the Henderson family, through the photograph that captures her in a position of service and dependency? These questions have no answers, but they guide Margaret's approach to sharing Rose Williams's story. She tries always to emphasize Rose's agency and humanity, to present her not just as a victim of historical circumstances but as a person who made choices, who found ways to resist and endure, who loved her daughter enough to send her away, who stood for a photograph that declared her existence and her worth. The torn photograph of Rose standing alone becomes, in Margaret's presentations, a symbol of that resistance, that refusal to be completely erased or forgotten. The work of historical recovery is never finished. Even after years of research and exhibition, there is always more to discover, always more questions to ask. Margaret continues to search for information about Rose Williams, knowing that each new detail adds depth and complexity to the story. She has connected with other researchers working on similar projects, people trying to recover the histories of enslaved and formerly enslaved people whose lives have been systematically excluded from official narratives. They share techniques and sources, supporting each other in work that is often emotionally difficult and professionally undervalued. The Henderson family photograph hangs now in the permanent collection of the National Museum of American History, positioned prominently in a gallery devoted to the post-Civil War South. Visitors stop in front of it every day, reading about Rose Williams and the Henderson family, thinking about what the photograph reveals about American history and about the ongoing legacy of slavery. Some visitors spend only a moment with the image before moving on. Others stand for a long time, studying Rose's face, trying to read in her expression some understanding of what her life was like, what she thought and felt and hoped for. The photograph cannot answer all the questions it raises. It cannot tell us Rose Williams's inner thoughts, cannot give her a voice that speaks directly to us across the decades. But it can do something equally important. It can force us to see her, to acknowledge her presence, to recognize that she was there, that she mattered, that her life and labor and dignity are part of the American story even when that story would prefer to forget her. In the doorway of the Henderson house, partially hidden in shadow, Rose Williams stands as a witness to a history that tried to render her invisible. Through Margaret's work of restoration and research, through Patricia's efforts to honor her ancestors' memory, through the exhibition that brings her story to thousands of visitors, Rose Williams has finally claimed a place in the historical record that cannot be erased. The photograph remains, a window into a past that is at once distant and achingly present, a reminder that every image contains layers of meaning, and that the work of understanding history requires us to look beyond what is immediately visible, to seek out the figures in the shadows, to listen for the voices that have been silenced, and to remember that every person who appears in these historical documents, whether in the foreground or the background, whether named or anonymous, whether acknowledged or ignored, was a human being who lived and struggled and hoped and deserved to be remembered with dignity and respect. Rose Williams's story is not just about the past. It is about how we choose to remember, what we decide matters, and who we recognize as part of our collective history. It is about seeing clearly even when what we see is difficult, and honoring the truth of human lives even when that truth challenges us to confront uncomfortable realities about the world our ancestors built and the world we continue to inhabit. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.